Hey Bears, this week is Mental Health Week and we want to make sure that you're taking the time to focus on you. So today what I'll be doing is I'm going to be showing you a recipe for a blueberry cinnamon loaf that you can have with your family and enjoy in your free time. So I know we talk a lot about your well-being and understanding how you can take care of yourself. And a lot of the time when we talk about food, we do tend to focus on the fact that we want you to eat healthy or we want you to take care of your body in healthy ways. But sometimes I think it's also important to understand the fact that you just need to treat yourself. And that's kind of what we're going to do today. It's not necessarily the healthiest recipe, but I think it is important to sometimes take a step back from always focusing on the healthy foods that you need to eat, and sometimes just focus on something that you're going to enjoy. So with this blueberry loaf, that's what we're going to do today. If you're looking to follow the recipe, I will end up linking it in the description of this YouTube video, or I will also post photos as I record this, probably on this side of the screen, just so you can follow along and you can see all the ingredients. But I will explain it as I go through it. I have everything pre-measured here, but I will also let you know what I'm doing as I'm doing it. So to start, we are going to mix our dry ingredients. So in a large bowl, we're going to be taking our flour, which is 1.5 cups of flour. We're going to be taking our sugar, 1.5 cups of sugar, and mixing it with 2 teaspoons of baking powder, a teaspoon of cinnamon, and half a teaspoon of salt. So we're going to start off by just mixing that all together and making sure those ingredients are well blended. And you may be wondering why I ended up picking this recipe. And the 2 things that stood out most to me was the fact that it was very carb focused and that it had blueberries in it. One thing that stands out to me when we're dealing with our mental health is understanding how our bodies work and interact with the food we eat. You may not know this, but you may find when you're feeling anxious or stressed, you're going to start craving carbs. And that comes down to the fact that the majority of your serotonin receptors are actually in your stomach. So when you're feeling anxious or feeling stressed, you may find yourself craving carbs because when you have those carbs, it actually boosts serotonin in your body. So if you're ever feeling stressed, you might want to turn to a carb because it might be a solution for you and it might make you feel better. The other important ingredient to me was blueberries because in case you didn't know, blueberries are considered a superfood because of all the antioxidants they have with them. So even though this isn't the healthiest recipe, you're still getting something mixed in there that's going to do some good for you along with the serotonin that's going to be coming from your carbs. So now that we have our dry ingredients mixed, we're going to move on to our wet ingredients. And this is a combination of 1/3 cup of milk, 1/4 cup of vegetable oil. I have 1 egg, and then we're also going to include 1 teaspoon of vanilla. I'm not sure if you have one of these, but I have a nice little mini whisk here. And we're just gonna whisk that all together and make sure it is well blended. I think another important thing to consider during this process of baking or doing something for your own benefit is understanding how you can take the time to make yourself feel better. Whether that is going for a run, reading a book, listening to some good music, you should always try to take the time to integrate something positive into your day. Even if you don't feel you might not have the time for it, it's always important to make sure you do make the time for it. So now that I have my dry ingredients together and I have my wet ingredients together, we're gonna mix the wet into the dry. So it's the easiest process. If you bake a lot, you know this isn't anything new. You're just gonna mix it all together until it's well blended. But since we are making something that is a bread base that needs to rise, just make sure you don't overmix what you have, because you might find that it ends up not rising as much as you want to. And it does say in the recipe, if you find that it's not quite mixing as well as you want, you can add some more milk to it. I can see here that it's still pretty doughy, pretty chunky. So I am gonna grab some milk from the fridge. And when you're doing this, make sure you just do it slowly and you don't add too much milk at once, because if you do, it might get runny and not rise properly either. In baking, a little bit of moisture can go a long way, so just be really careful of how much extra liquid you're willing to add. And now it looks about that we've gotten exactly how I described it. You want a thick, creamy texture. And now we're gonna end up folding in the blueberries. It does say in the recipe that to make sure you save some extra blueberries for on top. It just depends on your own opinion on how many blueberries you like in this. If you're a blueberry fan, throw as much as you want in there. And if not, maybe be a little more conservative with how much you add. I did add 1 cup of blueberries. On the recipe it does say 8 ounces, but it converts to a cup for you. You're just gonna wanna fold that in. Make sure you get those blueberries spread throughout and they aren't gonna be all stick into one part of your dough. And once you think you've mixed it well enough, you can start moving it into your pan. So the pan we have, it's your standard loaf pan. And what I did is I put some butter throughout it. Then I added some flour and just moved it around. And then I added a piece of parchment at the bottom. And the parchment just it makes it a lot easier to pull the loaf out so it doesn't stick to the bottom. It's really easy to take a knife around your sides, but on the bottom it gets a little more difficult. So if you have that parchment, it comes out so easily. And when you're doing this, also make sure that you are using a metal pan. If you end up using a glass pan, it's not gonna cook as well and it might cook inconsistently. So just be careful with what you use. Okay, so now we're just gonna be pouring this into our loaf pan. Just making sure as much of the mixture gets poured in. And make sure I don't drop my bowl into my loaf pan as I do this. And as always, in any form of baking, you're gonna wanna make sure you have a spatula with you because the dough always likes to hold on to the bowl you use, and you wanna make sure you get as much of that mixture as possible so you can have as much loaf once it's done cooking. So once you're happy with clearing out your bowl, just set that aside, and then make sure you just spread your mixture as much as you can throughout this pan. So you get as much of an even cook as possible. And then as it said in the recipe, if you want, you can add some extra blueberries on top. So I'm just gonna add some more to make sure we get that blueberry goodness and all the good nutrition that comes with them as well. I also think it makes it look pretty, so it's worth adding too. We're not done yet. Now, I just did a little off-camera cleaning, but we have to move on to the butter sugar topping that we're gonna put on top, just to make sure it has some extra cinnamon flavor. So to start, we are gonna get a 1/4 cup of brown sugar. And you just wanna make sure that your brown sugar isn't too hard. So if it is, just make sure you get any clumps out of it. It's gonna blend all together nicely. There we go. Next, we're gonna mix in the cinnamon sugar, which is I'm gonna use a teaspoon. It says a 1/2 teaspoon, but I like the flavor of cinnamon, so I'm gonna add a full teaspoon, just because I think it's a nice flavor to add to your recipe. And then we have a tablespoon of flour, just to help everything stay together. And then something else we're gonna be adding is unsalted butter. And the unsalted butter is just gonna be cut up into little pieces, and it's gonna help everything stick together. If you find that using a plate is easier, I just cut it into strips, and it kind of just crumbles in your hand. Unsalted butter usually is more crumbly than regular butter. So if you just cut it into thin strips, it usually just crumbles as you go along, which can make it a lot easier than trying to manually cut it into chunks, because butter tends to stick together otherwise. So now we have the butter all cut and chopped into our bowl. We can just start mixing it together. It depends on how comfortable you are. If you're down to make a mess, you can just mix it with your hands. Sometimes that just helps get the chunks integrated better. But if you're not looking to try to wash your hands 5 times to get grease off your fingers, sometimes the fork is just a better option. So you're just gonna mix it all together, make sure that everything is well combined. It is gonna very much look pretty like rocky. You're gonna look like you just have a bunch of pebbles mixed into it. But since we didn't add butter directly into our batter, this is gonna help add that butter throughout. So it might seem like a lot of butter on top, but considering you didn't actually add it into your original ingredients, it's gonna work out in the end. You gotta have faith. So now that we have our loaf and all the blueberries we added on top, we're just gonna pour this right on. Make sure it's evenly distributed. We want all that buttery flavor, that sugar, that cinnamon, just to have a nice even flavor throughout our loaf. And there we go. So now I'm gonna throw this loaf in the oven at 400 degrees for 40 to 50 minutes. And we're just gonna test it with a toothpick once it comes out to see if it's all ready to sit, and then we can enjoy it. Okay, so now we're back. It has come out of the oven, I let it cool for a bit, and I have put it on a plate. In the recipe, they have a glaze. It's just some icing sugar and milk you mix together, just as like a light icing to add a little bit of sugar on top. I will say, if you are doing this and you're gonna use frozen blueberries, make sure they're de-thawed and drain the liquid out of them. Because one of the issues I had was it ended up causing my loaf to sink a bit. So just be aware of that. Try to get as much liquid out of those blueberries as possible, just so you make sure your cake doesn't sink or doesn't quite cook as much as you want it to. But now it's just time to dig in, and I hope that this is something that you enjoyed and that it was relaxing and that it was part of you taking care of yourself. Take care, bears. Bye.